I am officially calling this meeting to order. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Alexander Society. This is a podcast dedicated to the discussion of history in the only way that we really know how, and that is filled to the brim with liquor. Tim, why didn't you introduce yourself?
I'm Tim. I'm a good friend of Derek's. We talk all the time about history with each other. Really, it's not really a discussion. He's really just educating me most of the time, and I just keep on asking questions to him. So this is kind of where our idea came from.
Yeah, so I'm an on and off history major, kind of. And I've been consuming all sorts of just history related stuff for most of my life, like a sponge. And I will just dump it all over anybody who will bother to listen to me for longer than 5 seconds. And so I figured that I might as well do it on a podcast. And so today we are going to be talking about actually the namesake of our illustrious organization, Alexander the Great. And I chose Alexander, or we chose Alexander specifically because in all of the pages of history and all of the eras of world history, nobody who drank as much as Alexander the Great did, and he drank a lot, was as successful at what it is that he did, which was basically conquering the world. So today, most of the information that I'm going to be talking about today, I got from the book Alexander of Macedon, 356 to 323 BC, a historical biography by Peter Green. First of all, Tim, what are you drinking?
So my liquor tonight will be Tito's vodka because that's what I had on hand,
Ooh,
and my sipper will be the Bud Light seltzer hard sodas because I thought it would be a horrible idea to try once.
watch this be just an absolutely horrible combination for you, and it just completely destroys you. So today I'm gonna be drinking. I've got like 2 shots left of Jeremiah Weed sarsaparilla whiskey, so that's gonna be probably my shots. And then I also have like 4 shots left of Jim Beam vanilla whiskey, which is gonna go in my mix. That's gonna be my sipper. All right, now let's go over the rules. So we're gonna turn this into a drinking game. We're gonna have some fun with it,
Okay.
and we have to lay down the rules real quick. Rule number one: we take a shot at the start of the episode. Let's go ahead and do that.
Rule number two.
Hold on, I still got to take my shot.
Oh, I thought you got it.
No, I didn't pour it ahead of time because I'm a hack and a fraud. Mm. Oh, I forgot how bad sarsaparilla whiskey is for shooting.
Rule number two is if there's an event where someone dies, we're going to take a sip.
Yep. It doesn't matter how many people die. It's one event where at least one person dies, and we take one sip. Rule number three: if we mention someone who was in a previous episode, and of course this is going to be for future episodes, if we mention somebody who is in a previous episode, we take a sip.
Rule number four, if alcohol is mentioned, we take a sip.
Yes, and that's very important because alcohol comes up a surprising amount in history. It's to blame for many of the worst things that humanity has ever done. Why is this cap on? So, ugh.
Maybe you haven't touched it since last time you drank.
Yeah, yeah. I don't drink as much as I should, honestly.
I haven't been drinking as much recently either, buddy.
Tim, while I'm pouring this, what's rule number five?
Rule number five, if there's an event in our story where someone dies and alcohol is involved, we take a shot.
Yeah, so I will tell you there is at least one event where that happens in this episode. Anyways, all the business out of the way, let's get started. Today we're talking about. I'm just going to list out all of his titles real quick because this is kind of ridiculous.
He did have a lot of them.
Yeah, he did. Alexandros, son of Philippos, Vasilevs of Macedon, hegemon of the Hellenic League, Strategos Autocrator of Greece, the Shan Shah of Persia, the Pharaoh of Egypt, and the Lord of all Asia. Those are all of the names or all of the titles that Alexander of Macedon would hold at the time of his death.
Goodness. I've always heard about Alexander throughout history, but I ain't really heard a lot about him. Like that he was this big imposing figure, but no one really talks about much other than oh, he did these few most known things, but not really his exploits in between.
Yeah, everybody knows vaguely that he's Greek and then don't know anything else beyond that, which is actually kind of funny because in his own time, other Greeks did not consider him Greek.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah, and the reason for that was because he was Macedonian, and Macedon was notorious for being a very frontier kingdom in the Greek peninsula. So while all of the other city states were starting to move towards like democratic and republican sorts of forms of government, they were still stuck in like a semi-tribal sort of kingship setup where they still had king and nobility.
So it's not like I was thinking for a second. I was thinking it was maybe a little bit like those countries after the USSR broke up.
Yeah, not quite like that. It's more like just because of a weird geopolitical situation, Macedon didn't develop in the same way that the other Greek states did, and so as a result, they kept a lot of like really old traditions and forms of government that other Greek states kind of saw as barbaric, and so they kind of considered Macedonians to be like half Hellenized barbarians.
Okay.
They that made it all the worse for them when what we're going to talk about came later. All right.
Ugh.
So uh, before we talk about Alexander, let's talk about the history of
Oh, I'm
Greece and
sure.
Persia
I'm
before
sure.
Alexander. So, like I said, the two important regions we're going to be talking about are Greece and the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Achaemenids being the dynasty that was ruling the Persian Empire at the time.
Okay.
Greece at that time was made up of various city states with a whole bunch of different styles of government. They generally trended towards republicanism, but there were a lot of exceptions to that. The two most prominent of these states were Athens and Sparta. Athens was like the prototypical like liberal citizens democracy where they didn't have like a specific ruler. They just had like an assembly that debated on policy and things like that.
So, kind of like what you think of when you historically think of Greece. Oh, they created the modern democracy, blah, 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 all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, like the founding fathers were obsessed. They were obsessed with Athens and specifically Athens and the Roman Republic. They could not get enough like like liberals at the time of like the founding fathers were obsessed with classical learning and of like the Greek and Roman republics, and Athens was one of those big ones. It's like that is the standard of a democracy that we should strive for. And that's kind of weird because Athens government kind of sucked. It wasn't really a democracy. It was because the only people who were allowed to vote or get into politics were specific, like there was literally like a wealth requirement. You had to have a certain amount of wealth in order to be considered a citizen.
That's weird.
Yeah, it was very explicit.
From a modern perspective, I guess, because we're so used to our modern society context, it's hard to sit back and think, well, a lot of rights that we're used to for everyone weren't really the norm. It was usually the elites.
From my perspective, things haven't really changed. I mean,
At least we have the perceived notion. Back then, there was no perception.
yeah, there's at least nowadays there's the idea that everybody should have the right to vote. Back then, it was like yeah, you get the right to vote if you're rich enough, and they still had slaves too. Like all the guys who were debating like liberty and freedom of speech in the halls of Athens democracy, like almost all of them owned slaves. So so we had Athens, the prototypical citizens democracy, and we had Sparta. They were the other most powerful state,
Of course.
and they were the complete polar opposite. They were a highly stratified militant society where they were ruled by they actually had two kings, and they were both hereditary titles, but they were kings that they had veto power over each other, and they had to agree with one another on a policy for it to get passed.
Interesting. I've never heard of that.
And yeah, and so Spartan society was made up of like an upper class, like the top, like the fifth, like 15% of the population were like professional soldiers.
Interesting.
Like that was their full time job, and that's everything that they did.
I'm kind of surprised it wasn't higher because, when you think Spartans, you think of the way pop culture perceives them now, and it's nothing but warriors.
Right,
So I kind of have that biased.
right. Well, the reason that there's that bias is because the other 85 or 90% of the population were all slaves.
Of course.
Yeah, they were slaves. That they were called helots. To give you an idea of the place that they held in society, there was an annual festival every year that was celebrated in Sparta, where the young men who were just finishing their training to become warriors would have a rite of passage where they'd have to go into the countryside and murder as many helots as they could.
What the fuck?
Yeah, it's called the culling of the helots, and you could not be considered a man in Spartan society unless you were involved, unless you went through that.
Of course. Jesus.
Yeah, so next time you're watching 300, keep in mind, all of those guys were slave owning pieces of shit, but at the same time, they were also pedophiles. So let's get that out of the way real quick.
Honestly, pedophilia is more prevalent in history than anyone likes to think or talk about.
Someday, one of these days, I'm gonna get into uh, a topic relating to the British Empire, and that's gonna be
Oh,
very important, I
God.
think.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm certain.
So Athens and Sparta, they were the most powerful states in ancient Greece. But there were lots of other ones with varying degrees of power. Thebes was another really big one, and they held a lot of very important cultural prominence in Greece. And a lot of these city states pretty regularly fought against one another for domination of the Aegean Sea. The Aegean Sea was really important because it was kind of the crossroads for trade between Asia and Europe. So basic,
I kind of figured that's why they would fight over it is trade routes.
yeah, it's part of the reason why Greek society became so prominent in like modern society, because for the time there was a certain level of cultural and technological advancement in Greece that you didn't see in a lot of other places, specifically because they got so much of the trade that was crossing between Europe and Asia, and it made them rich. It's like filthy rich. Um and so one of these city states, well, I guess it wasn't really a city state. It was the kingdom of Macedon with their capital at the city of Pella. And Macedon was was a kingdom in like the northern part of Greece. There's If you look at a map of Greece at the very top, there's like a peninsula sticking out with like three little tentacle things sticking out of it. All of the area right above that peninsula was where Macedon was. Um, and it was really out of the way. It was really kind of divided from the rest of Greek society. And that's why they ended up being, like I said, they ended up being so culturally different from a lot of the other Greek states. And another part of it was that they were kind of on the frontier of Greece, so they were completely surrounded by non-Greek tribal societies like the Odrysians, the Thracians, the Illyrians.
Interesting. You said it was on a peninsula. I would assume since it's there, it would be near a trade route. So why wouldn't they have been incorporated more?
Well, because they didn't actually control the peninsula; they only controlled the land above it. The actual peninsula was controlled by uh, the Thessalian League, or no, the Thessalian League was on the other side. It was the Chalcidic League. That's it.
Oh,
We'll get to that though. And then besides Greek, we had Asia, which this is Asia referring to what the Greeks thought was Asia, which is what we now call the Middle East.
Okay.
So everywhere from what's now modern day Turkey down into like Syria, Israel, Palestine, Iraq, Iran, even all the way out to like Afghanistan and Western India and Pakistan.
You know, I always forget that that's all in the same area. Like I know it consciously, but I think of them so culturally different, at least modernly, that they're two separate pieces of society. But that you're right. Historically, they were in that same kind of China area back in the day.
Yeah, like India and the Middle East were basically like they had a lot of. It's really weird because India and the Middle East had a lot of communication with both China and Europe, but then like Europe and China barely got any at all because of their distance from each other. And so
Weird.
yeah, so there's a lot of, I mean, not a lot of cultural influence, but a lot of the geopolitical developments in Western and Southern Asia happened because of their association with China, and then those changing geopolitical situations then affected what was going on in Europe economically and politically and things like that.
Okay.
It's a it's a really interesting situation that I might get into different topics that kind of explore that later. But for now, ancient Asia, which so Asia, as the Greeks called it, or the Middle East, as we now call it. It was home to a huge variety of different cultures and societies that even the Greeks saw as ancient. Like these societies were the oldest societies in human history. Like the area that's known as the Fertile Crescent. You've probably heard that term in like high school history. The Fertile Crescent.
Vaguely sounds familiar, but I can't really remember what it's associated with.
So it's a stretch of extremely fertile farmland, mostly concentrated in like different river valleys that stretches all the way from the Tigris and Euphrates River in modern day Iraq, all the way down the eastern Mediterranean coast, down into the Nile region in Egypt. And it's believed that the Fertile Crescent is where agriculture was first invented.
Cool.
And so agriculture eventually led to the first like advanced organized societies, which led to the first city states, and then eventually it led to the first empires that ever existed in human society. And that's mainly the area that we're going to be talking about with this subject, is a place so ancient that even the Greeks, like, it was to the Greeks what the Greeks are to us. That is how old it is.
That's weird. We don't really talk about that anymore then.
Right. It's crazy. We don't talk about how old human civilization really is. And a big part of that is that people don't really think about it because like we kind of have an under like people are familiar with more recent history and history that immediately resulted in like the societies that we have now that we actually interact with, but so much of the seeds that were planted, like basic stuff that we don't even think about, like the existence of governments, got started in the Fertile Crescent. Like the idea of having somebody being in charge to enforce laws was invented in this area like 6 or 7 thousand years ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and we don't give it the attention it deserves because we most people's attention span only goes to like 1776.
Yeah.
Anything before that is like, oh, I don't care, doesn't affect me, right?
And honestly, it's sad. If you really get down to think about it, our history is so much greater than ours, I say, like as in human history, um, then we really sit and like teach most people about. Like
Right.
it blows my mind at how much history we actually have access to academically, but what's actually taught to us.
Yeah, it's absolutely phenomenal how much information is actually left out of like the curriculums that are taught in schools and how they're presented. And I think an area of discussion that people really don't focus on when they're talking about like, oh, they're indoctrinating our kids and all that kind of stuff that people talk about in schools, is that the way that like the general everyday person interprets history is completely clouded and affected by what kind of information we put into what we teach them and what it is that we keep out. So, while various kings had built empires in the area of the Middle East, they started out as just like city states, and they went and they started conquering other city states. And once you had a ruler that ruled over more than one city state, that was basically how you got the first emperors and empires.
I mean, it's a logical next jump. You control one area. Well, I want to control more area because we think of ancient rulers as greedy people, and I guess in a way they were.
Right. Yeah, but like if you look at like the Babylonians or the like um like the Assyrians, you look at the amount of land that they held in their empires, it's like it's 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 like the size of modern nations. Like what they considered to be like brutal imperialist systems are like just your standard for like what a nation looks like nowadays.
You're right. You're right.
Like the Babylonian Empire existed in what's now modern Iraq, but it held less land than the modern state of Iraq holds now.
Wow.
Like, and it was considered an empire. It was considered the first empire.
Okay.
It's it's wild how things change and how our definitions and ideas about how things exist kind of change with our perspectives. Yeah, so a lot of these empires we'd consider to be like smaller than what we'd associate with like the word empire. Um, that was until Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus the Great was a Persian. He was born into nobility and he was the king of a small city in what's now modern day Iran, which is where Persian people still exist. They're called Iranians now. And he was the vassal under an empire called the Median Empire. Um, Eventually, he rose to the throne and he revolted against the Median Empire. And his revolt went so well that he ended up conquering the entire Median Empire.
Damn.
The the vassal conquered the empire that he was a subject of,
Okay.
and then he just kept going. In 539 BC, he conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And once he finished conquering the Babylonians, that essentially made him the very first person to rule all of ancient Asia, or what we now call the Middle East. So, so that was the first like big what we would now call an empire, at least in like the Mediterranean area.
Okay.
The Chinese had already done, way better, but that's a discussion for another time.
Yeah, we kind of got to stay on subject. We could go into tangent after tangent on history because history connects every left and right.
Right. Yeah, there's so many connections I could make everywhere. It's so many tangents I could go on. But we are currently on page 3 of a 31-page script.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, just to keep it brief for our audience. So, the great grandnephew of Cyrus and the king of the Persian Empire, Darius the Great, who controlled the same empire, he attempted an invasion to conquer Greece in 492 BCE, and that was in retaliation for the the Greek states giving support to a revolt of other Greek cities which existed on Asia Minor, which Asia Minor was the ancient name for what's now modern day Turkey. And the west coast of Turkey had a whole bunch of Greek city states that ran basically just the same as the ones on the Greek peninsula, but when the Persian Empire came through, they all got conquered by the Persians.
Of course.
In the 6th century BCE, they tried to revolt against the Persians, and the other Greek city states gave them aid. And so, in response to that, Darius the Great attempted to invade, and the king of Macedon at the time, Amyntas the First,
Yeah.
He immediately just gave up. He just rolled over and he immediately submitted to the Persians. He didn't even try to resist.
Oh, damn.
So the first invasions were eventually stopped by a combined Greek army led by the Athenians at the Battle of Marathon. So the word marathon, um, like to describe like a 23-mile run, that actually that actually comes from the Battle of Marathon. Um, so there's a story that after the Battle of Marathon was won by the Athenian hoplites, that one of the messengers for the army ran all the way from Marathon back to Athens, which was 23 miles, and ran into the Athenian assembly to declare that the Athenians had beaten the Persians and pushed them back. And then he immediately keeled over and died.
Oh, shit.
And so, in honor of him, uh, people. So, in honor of kind of that memory, uh, the Olympic Games in ancient Greece started kind of on and off. It wasn't really super popular, but it was a thing. They implemented a competition that they called the marathon, where competitors would race over 23 miles.
Holy crap. To think that the origin of a marathon, I didn't even know marathons were a thing back then. I thought they were a very modern concept. It started because of the announcement of winning a war?
Yeah, 492 BCE. Yeah, so Athenians stopped them at the Battle of Marathon, and then a couple decades later, the Persians had tried to invade again. The second Persian invasion was where like the story of the 300 Spartans came from. They stopped the Persian army at the pass at Thermopylae
All right.
and were all killed. But in reality, there was like 2,000 there. There were only 300 Spartans, but there was like 2,000 troops from other Greek city states. But they held up the Persian army at Thermopylae long enough so that the Athenian navy could organize itself to defend the straits between the region of Attica, where Athens is, and the island of Salamis. And so they outnumbered like 3-1. The Athenian navy confronted the Persian navy and defeated them in the straits near Salamis, and that's is now called the Battle of Salamis. And that ended the second Persian invasion. So, following the expulsion of the Persians, a power struggle ensued between the former allies Athens and Sparta over who would have dominance over the Hellenic world, and it eventually resulted in the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, which lasted from 431 to 405 BCE, so almost 30 years. While most of the Greek city states chose one side or the other, like draining their manpower and resources for all 3 decades of the war, Macedon managed to stay out of it and actually got rich off of it by selling cattle and timber to both sides of the war.
Isn't that how a lot of people who quote unquote stay out of the war go? Is instead of joining the war, they just help quote unquote help both sides and they just make money off of it.
Right. Yeah, like anytime that an envoy would come from either Athens or Sparta to Macedon to like organize new trade agreements or to try and convince them to join the respective alliance, they'd just be like, "Oh yeah, we'll think about it. You're a best friend, so we'll think about it." And then just immediately turn around and keep doing the exact same thing to the other side. And so when Sparta eventually won the war, which it's kind of funny, they actually won the war because they got help from Persia.
Of course.
Yeah. um, so when Sparta won the war, Macedon emerged unscathed and extremely wealthy, naturally.
Of course.
And so that leads into probably the second most important character in our story, and that's King Philip II of Macedon. He was the great grandson of that guy I mentioned earlier, Amyntas, who rolled over when the Spartans invaded.
Okay.
Um, and the reason we're going to talk about him a lot pretty soon, and the reason we're going to talk about him a lot is because Alexander would not have existed if it weren't for Philip. Philip built the Macedon that allowed Alexander to do everything that he did.
So he kind of set the stage for Alexander. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, he made Macedon the most powerful uh, nation in Greece and built up a professional army, which Alexander would then go on to use to conquer all of Asia.
Crazy.
So when Philip was young, he was a diplomatic hostage in the city of Thebes, which at the time was showing signs of becoming the newest military superpower in Greece. They were starting to build up a very professional army that was starting to eclipse those of Athens and Sparta. Um, and while he was growing up, he was being taught by probably one of the most brilliant generals of the period, a guy named Epaminondas. Epim.
So, how did the diplomatic how did his staying in the other country go? Was he like just a hostage, or how did that work?
Um, so he was. It was implied that if Macedon didn't do what Thebes wanted, then he would be killed. But until that actually happened, he was kind of treated as like a guest of honor. So
Okay. So is it kind of like how is this kind of how where the origin of the two countries exchange a son of a high political figure happened, or had this already started?
yeah, that's exactly what's going on here.
Okay.
So the guy who was ruling Macedon was actually, I think it was Philip's cousin or something. I can't remember now. I'm a hack and a fraud, but it was a relative of Philip who was ruling Macedon at the time. And Macedon was ostensibly supposed to be next in line for the throne when his father died, but then a whole bunch of like assassinations and stuff happened, and this other guy ended up on the throne. And so he was sent as a political prisoner to Thebes, where he was raised. And he was raised under the tutelage of that general Epaminondas. Epa, Epaminondas. I these names, I swear to God. Epaminondas, I think. And he educated him in military strategy and how to build like a professional army as opposed to like just because at the time what most Greek city states were doing was they just take whatever random poor people they could find on farms or in the streets of the city, whatever, and just give them a sword and like throw them at the enemy.
I'm not even surprised. I kind of feel like that's how a lot of historical wars worked.
Yeah, yeah, that's how most wars before the modern era worked. But he was teaching, but he got taught how like why it's important to have like a professional army of like really well trained and disciplined troops. Okay, yeah, it was his brother Perdiccas who was in charge of Macedon at the time. So his brother Perdiccas died. He ended up taking the throne. Another little bit of intrigue. Um, and he completely reformed the Macedonian military. Uh, he properly organized the cavalry, which was already really good. They had really good cavalry. He reorganized them into what's now called the companion cavalry, which were easily the best cavalry in ancient Greece. They were second to none.
Okay.
And he also professionalized his infantry wing that stopped being just like a mob of peasants. He turned it into, you might have heard this word before, the phalanx.
I've heard it, but I've never really got an explanation of what it is. Like,
Yeah. So a phalanx in ancient Greece was a regiment of pikemen, and you had to be extremely well drilled and well trained in order to have a group of men use pikes correctly because they had to fight in extremely tight formations. They couldn't break at all. They had to hold their pikes a very specific way, or else they'd either break because these pikes were almost 20 feet long.
damn.
These pikes that they fought with, like they were ridiculously long, and it gave them an advantage of reach, but it also made their formations extremely unwieldy. And so you had to use them a certain way in battle, but if you use them correctly, they could not be broken. It was almost impossible to fight these guys because you could never reach them with your swords, and even if you could, they just wouldn't run away because they were so well trained. So yeah, that is the military that Philip made, and pretty soon he was about to put it to use. So the relative degradation and the weakness of the other Greek states meant that it was a good time for Philip to start throwing Macedon's weight around. He used his fancy new military both to consolidate Macedonian power over the tribes of Thrace and Illyria, which were two regions that were right there by northern Greece. And also he used it against the traditional powerhouses of Greece to his south, like Athens and Thebes and Sparta. While he started to start to throw his weight around, he married his third wife because his first two wives had died.
Is it one of those mysterious circumstances, or was it?
No, they both just died in childbirth. It was like a coin toss whether or not you died while you gave birth back then.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, there was nothing sketchy about it. It's just that they just died. But he married his third wife, who was a princess of the kingdom of Epirus, which was another Greek state. Her name was Myrtale, or Myrtale. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. Um, but history knows her better as Olympias. And Olympias gave birth to Philip's second son on probably on July 20th, 356 BCE. We're not really sure when the exact date is, but it was probably July 20th. She gave birth to Philip's second son and named it after her brother, Alexander.
Oh.
And as soon as he's born, there are myths about him.
Of course, like every great historical figure.
Yeah, just immediately start making stuff up about him. One story goes that on the day he was born, the temple of Artemis at the city of Ephesus, which was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, it burned to the ground.
Wow.
Uh,
That would be a bad omen. Way bad.
it, that's exactly how it was taken, because Ephesus was one of the most important Greek cities in Asia Minor, or like modern day Turkey. Um, and so some interpreted it as an omen that Asia was about to burn.
Did it?
It took them a couple decades, but yeah, basically. um,
I feel like time like that, historic back then, was relatively short because they didn't view like a generation or two was a short time to them because they didn't really like it was still the beginning. They weren't they're not used to like us. We have a long history that we already know about. We kind of can judge how things go nowadays.
well, remember what I said. They had an ancient history too, and they had a lot of legends that they considered to be their history. Like we're going to talk a little bit about like the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Homeric myths. They considered that to be their history, and so they saw themselves as ancient as we do.
Wow.
So there was another legend. It's probably a significantly more important legend, because this would affect Alexander like personally and would have influenced him a lot. And that was a legend that actually got started by his own mother, that on her wedding night she was impregnated by Zeus, and that the child that she gave birth to was Alexander,
Of course.
which would make Alexander a demigod.
Okay.
Um, there was that kind of worked well with another legend that already existed about Alexander's family. It was called the Argead dynasty, was what his family was called. And they claimed that they were descended from Hercules, who was the son of Zeus. And so it that kind of like fit into, like, yeah, he's already in the family of Zeus. It makes sense that Zeus would bless the family with another child. Like,
Strengthen the bloodline.
right. Um and this particular obvious lie would have horrible ramifications for the entire Middle East.
Of course. Of course.
uh, because it was myths like that and that gave Alexander a sense of destiny, like divinely destined things that he was going to do.
He felt like that he had a name that he had to live up to, kind of.
Right. He had a name that he had to live up to, but he was also, because he was of divine blood and of noble heritage, he was owed certain things. He was owed the glory of winning wars and conquering. It was his by birthright, and in practice he would do literally anything he possibly could fulfill that destiny.
As one does when there's being a descendant of Zeus.
Of course, yeah, like That honestly, the stuff he does in Persia is not out of line with stuff that Zeus would do. Like if you know anything about like the old Greek legends, it's not out of character. Like father, like son. By most accounts, Alexander was kind of a brat as a kid. We can't exactly blame him for it, though. He didn't grow up in a great environment. Macedonian court life was shockingly violent, even by the standards of the ancient world. Court intrigue that resulted in assassinations and poisonings and things like that were a regular fixture. Like it was kind of understood that if you were a nobleman in Macedon, you were constantly trying to kill somebody secretly. It was just understood. And then on top of that, uh, one of the reasons that a lot of other Greek states kind of considered them violent was that they held these enormous feasts for literally anything. These feasts that would just giant parties where everybody would get raging drunk and get into fights and all of that kind of stuff. And that's part of the reason why Macedonians had a reputation for being like violent barbarians. And so this is the kind of life that Alexander grew up in. It was that was his upbringing, and it was not very conducive to like a healthy mentality in a child. But even as a kid, he was showing signs of being extremely clever. He started picking up on the intricacies of court politics and of like foreign diplomacy and things like that from a very early age. And probably more importantly, he was spoiled rotten by his mother. Olympius gave him anything he wanted whenever he wanted and was constantly telling him that he was destined for greatness and that anybody who stood in his way deserved to be pushed out and knocked down. And that like like hold that in your head and think about that while we talk about some of the stuff that he did, cuz it's going to put it in a really really weird light. So like even from an early age, he was desperate to be the greatest at absolutely everything. He had to live up to his divine heritage and his like noble upbringing. Um, and so as a result, like he also became very reverent. He became very spiritual. He took ritual and religion very very seriously. He was always very generous in his offerings to the gods. He was always perfectly on time with all of his prayers and his
As one
visits
does.
to different temples and things like that. So as a kid, his first bit of like actual like formal education came from his first tutor, a guy named Leonidas. Not to be confused with the Spartan king who died at the Battle of Thermopylae. That guy was a cuck. Um, this Leonidas was, just a child abuser. uh, he was a militant disciplinarian, which was, kind of in line with his namesake. And he kept Alexander on a strict regimen of exercise every single day, constantly working out, constantly like just getting. He'd do this thing where he'd just throw Alexander out in the woods for a few days and tell him to find his way home.
Jesus.
Yeah. um,
Are you sure he didn't try infanticide?
yeah, he survived, so who can tell? um, and of course, Alexander hated him because of his strictness.
As one does when getting thrown out in the woods for no damn reason.
Right. But one thing that he did get from Leonidas is a love for physical fitness. Um, he would constantly work out, and he would like through his whole life, he'd constantly do everything he could to stay in top physical shape. Even at the age of like 6 or 7, people were already talking about him going into the Olympic Games as a runner because he was a. Some people say that he ran as fast as horses. Like, of course, that's an exaggeration, but like it gives you an idea of what people thought about it, like his physical ability.
He had to be fast to be able to be considered to compete against adults.
Like they were just like speculating on like what his future would look like. Like he could like he could go into the Olympics in the future. Like he shows promise now. But yeah, he would eventually compete in the Olympics. He wouldn't actually. Well, I say compete. He never actually competed because he refused to run against any competitors who weren't kings
Of course.
because he was self righteous and an annoying asshole. Uh, but yeah, his physique was legendary and actually probably saved his life countless times while he was on campaign as an adult. Um, like anytime he would get sick or get hurt, he'd always bounce back because he was just in such good shape and so healthy.
That's crazy to think about back then, though. We like to consider us our technologically advanced that we know how to make people live longer, but he had been in like
Right,
absolutely bodybuilder shape, like not like the weightlifting kind, but like this is the kind of person who hits the gym daily.
right. Yeah, and despite that, you're going to be surprised how long he lived. During this time that he was being trained by Leonidas, there's this really interesting story um, where there's like, so somebody brings, there's this guy, he's selling horses, like really high quality studs that he brings to Philip in order to sell him some stud horses so he could raise up some good cavalry stock. Um, and one of these horses he brings forward is named Bucephalus, and he offers like a moderately like it's a really nice horse. Like it's very well bred, it's very strong, it's young, but he's offering a really low price for it. And Philip's kind of like curious about it, and so he brings Bucephalus out to a stable or a corral and tries to ride it, and Bucephalus immediately bucks him off.
Jesus.
And so he starts getting a bunch of other nobles who are in attendance there to try and break this horse. And with each nobleman that fails, he gets more and more frustrated, and he's about to like call this horse salesman like a hack and a thief until Alexander, at the age of 9, comes up to his father and says, "Oh, I can break that horse,"
As one does when being a descendant of Zeus.
as one does when he's a descendant of Zeus. And so Philip's like, "No, you can't. You're 9." And he's like, "Yeah, I can. Watch me." And he hops into the corral with this horse, and he just stares at it. He just stands there and stares at the horse, and the horse stares back. He takes a couple steps forward. The horse doesn't react. He takes a couple more. He brings up his hand, and he's just staring directly into this horse's eyes. And he starts like stroking the horse's snout. Um, he comes around to his side, starts stroking his side, and then all of a sudden, without the horse realizing it, he just jumps on the horse's back. The horse immediately takes off, just bolts away out of the corral, just off into the woods. And Philip is terrified that he's just lost his son.
I mean, I can't blame the guy. A 9-year old hopping on a freaking horse?
Yeah, not because he cared about Alexander. He really didn't. He was just scared that if he didn't have an heir, that somebody would come and try to kill him. Then a few minutes later, Philip or Alexander came back riding on the horse, pulled the horse up in front of Philip, hopped off, and said, yeah, I could do it. Showed, told you." And that is how.
Just casually, just like, yeah, I broke this horse that no one else could.
Yeah, he was 9 years old. That's the story, anyways. I don't. It's probably not true, but we do know that he had a horse named Bucephalus in real life, and he rode that horse all the way from Greece to Bactria, which is now modern day Afghanistan.
Okay.
Um,
What would the equivalent of that in the US be? How
um,
like how far a distance would that be?
oh, I can't, I'm not really sure. Here, I'll check. Um, distant. Why is my caps lock on? Distance from Greece to Afghanistan. Um, it's about 4,000 kilometers. Um, probably about 2,500 miles. So
That's a good way. Damn.
yeah, he. Spoiler alert: Alexander conquered a lot of land.
Oh, I would have never guessed.
Yeah, there's a reason he's called the Great. So while Alexander was being educated back in Pella, Philip was busy using his fancy new army to make Macedon the most powerful state in all of Greece. Um, in 348, he captured the city of Olynthos, which was the chief city of the Chalcidic League that I was telling you about, that peninsula, um, which basically secured his control over all of northern Greece because the Chalcidic League was the most uh, powerful entity in northern Greece. Um, it had been allied with Athens, but Athens didn't help them during this conflict because Athens at that time had a policy of, we'll ally with people, but we won't actually help them in a war unless we know they can win. So we'll just sit on our hands until it becomes obvious who's going to win, and then we'll join the winning side. They did that everywhere, and it always came back to bite them in the ass.
I mean, they probably could have gotten some more wins for their allies, quote unquote, if they'd actually stepped in, because more firepower.
Yeah, but this time it actually came to bite them in the ass, like, really quickly, because during the peace treaty, um, Philip Philip bribed all of the peace envoys that came from Athens into just accepting his terms. And so when the envoys came back with the peace treaty, it broke the Athenian political system. Uh, they were completely shocked by how much Athens lost in this peace treaty. Like, power wise, like all of the allies of theirs that had to be broken up and subjugated by Macedon, and so it started this long, uh, like this process of people like throwing accusations of bribery and stuff at one another, and it really heavily discredited Athens in the eyes of the other Greek states. Um, at the same time, he had also just got Philip had also just gotten involved in the Third Sacred War, and the Sacred War was um, a war between several different Greek states over control of the oracle at Delphi.
I've heard a little bit about the Oracle, but not a lot.
Yeah, the oracle was probably the most important religious figure in all of Greece. Basically, imagine if the Pope took magic mushrooms and gave people prophecies.
That's kind of funny sounding.
That's Yeah, that's essentially what the oracle was. Also, the Pope was a woman.
Well, I knew the Oracle was a woman, but it's crazy to think that you could have what honestly would probably be the equivalent of like a hippie stoner today, female, just well, not stoner, but like someone who gets high on substances and just spout nonsense and be like, yes, we you are our future teller. You got everything we need.
Yeah, yeah. So he successfully brought the Third Sacred War to the end, and um, the oracle at Delphi uh, gave um, gave Philip like their public support, basically, which very much improved his position, like on a religious basis, in the eyes of the rest of Greece. And then he conquered the region of Thessaly, which was just right by Macedon. Was in was It was controlled by the Thessalian League, and he basically just broke up the Thessalian League and brought all the cities there um, under his control. And that's going to be it's not very important now, but the cavalry that he gets from Thessaly is going to be important later, because Thessalian cavalry were some of the best in Greece, and they're going to play some pretty important roles in some of Alexander's battles. And then, by 346 BCE, Macedon was 100% the most powerful nation in all of Greece, like undisputed.
Of course.
Um, and it was about that time that Philip was first approached by an Athenian political writer named Isocrates. Not Socrates, Isocrates. There's an I at the beginning.
Okay.
Um, and Isocrates,
I thought there was an A. It sounded like an A.
Isocrates, and that's not no relation to Socrates, the famous philosopher.
I didn't figure. I figured you would have started that out like, oh, Socrates is related something or the other.
Right. No, this is just some random guy from Athens.
Okay.
But he came to Philip and gave him this interesting proposal. Socrates had like this high-minded, idealistic dream of all of the Greek states uniting in as like a single confederation and launching a punitive expedition to against Persia in as like punishment for the Persian invasions like 3 generations before this.
We gotta defend our honor.
Yeah, it was complete nonsense. Nobody in Greece cared about Persia.
Okay.
Um, but this guy was like, "Yeah, we've got to go kill some Persians for this thing that happened to our great grandfathers." So the idea was obviously ridiculous on his face, but it gave Philip a really interesting idea for his future policy towards the rest of Greece. We'll get to that in a minute. But back to Alexander. By this point, he was becoming a teenager. He had moved out to this region on the frontier of the kingdom near the old capital of Macedon, which was a city called. Oh, it's spelled Aigai. I think in Greek it's supposed to be pronounced like Ai or something like that. But it's in a region that was at the time it was called the Gardens of Midas, and he was going to be tutored in philosophy. And his teacher was probably one of the only other names in the story that the average non-history person is going to recognize, and that was Aristotle.
Yeah.
Yeah, Aristotle was Alexander the Great's tutor. Aristotle was the student of Plato, and Plato was the student of Socrates.
That. Yeah, I knew that. I took a philosophy class.
Oh, okay. Um, while he was being tutored, he was joined by several other princes of the kingdom, including this kid named Hephaestion.
Okay.
And Hephaestion would be Alexander's best friend for the rest of his life, up until like 2 months before he died. Uh, we'll get to that. Um, Another boy was Cassander, um, who would eventually be one of Alexander's generals and then successors after his death. And another boy was Ptolemy, who would also be one of his successors. Aristotle's lessons gave him two important ideas that would shape his ambitions. The first was the idea of arete, which is Greek basically for like basically means like noble virtue, basically like the virtue that's inherent in that or that you have to express in order to properly convey like your nobility. It's kind of complicated, but it'll make more sense in context.
Is it anything like noblesse oblige?
What's that?
I'm looking up the exact definition, but from what I understand, duty, quote unquote, of a noble to do what they feel is right for their people.
Yeah, basically. Um, and Alexander was taught the idea of arete through his reading of the Iliad. He idolized Achilles and would constantly be trying to basically be Achilles through his entire life.
So The official definition of noblesse oblige is the inferred responsibility of privileged people to act with generosity towards and nobility towards those less privileged. So not quite the same, but pretty close.
Yeah, yeah, that's the general idea of what like arete is. Basically, if you're if you're going to have power, you need to demonstrate a certain sort of virtue. And Alexander thought that that sort of virtue was best exemplified by Achilles.
Okay.
Um, the second lesson that Aristotle taught him is that barbarian people like Persians were hedonistic and deserved to be subjugated.
As one does back when they think they're better than everyone.
Yeah, as one does when you are the son of Zeus.
Yeah.
Also, he learned about medicine and science, but that's not really important to the story. While he was being taught by Aristotle, shit was starting to go down with Athens. So Philip was going on campaign to pacify the Macedonian frontiers in Thrace, which you know where Istanbul or Constantinople, you know where that is?
Not really. I was never a geography person, but I know of the country and what happened.
Okay. Yeah, so it's the region that's just to the west of like modern day Istanbul. That's Thrace.
Okay.
And so Philip was over there trying to pacify Thrace, and Athens was getting pissed off about it because they thought that he was about to attack the city of Byzantium. Byzantium would eventually become Constantinople, would eventually become Istanbul. But that's not important. Byzantium was important to Athens because it was the Byzantium controlled all of the trade through the Strait of Dardanelles, which was all of the trade from the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea.
Okay.
And most of Athens' grain supply came from Crimea, or like modern day Ukraine. So it had to go through the Dardanelles, through Byzantium, in order to get there. And so if Philip captured Byzantium, then he would have a stranglehold over the food supply of Athens. And Athens really didn't want that. So they started reaching out to other Greek city states, kind of poking out the idea of like a pan Hellenic alliance against Macedon. And they even sent an envoy to Persia to try and get the Persian king's help antagonizing Philip, which they actually agreed to because they thought it was good to keep any one state in Macedon or in Greece from getting too powerful. And so Philip responded by launching a campaign against the three Greek states in Thrace, which were allied to Athens, which brought him into war with Athens. When he did this, he realized he's going to have a prolonged campaign. He wouldn't be home for a while. And so he gave Alexander his first taste of leadership. And at the age of 16, Alexander was made regent of the kingdom. His term as regent was generally uneventful, not much happened. He spent most of his time schmoozing up to some high ranking nobles and being nice to like the local townspeople in order to make them like him in preparation for when he would take the throne. Um, and while he did that, Philip was taking his army south towards Athens, and the Athenians made the mistake of believing that they could hold Philip's army in the narrow mountain passes in central Greece, instead of doing the smart thing, which is to leverage their ridiculously powerful navy, and put pressure on his supply lines in order to force them to retreat, which would have been the smart thing and they would have won. But no, they were still all obsessed with like this idea of the noble Athenian hoplite defending Greece at the Battle of Marathon. Um, Even though they hadn't really used their own militias since the Battle of Marathon and were almost exclusively using like mercenaries by this point. So they didn't have an army that could stand up to Philip's professional army.
That sounds extremely short sighted.
It was extremely short sighted, and it's one of the main arguments that a lot of philosophers have used against the idea of representative democracy. Not that I agree with it, but like, yeah, it was really dumb. So they failed to use their navy effectively. Philip ended up, even though they were blocking all the mountain passes, Philip still found a way to outflank all of them and force them to retreat to one spot where they could make a final stand. They were joined by the army of Thebes, which actually did have a really well trained army that could probably stand toe to toe with Philip's. And they met in a mountain valley near a settlement called Chironea. And Chironea would be the very first time that Alexander would ever see battle. He was recalled from Pella, and he was given command of the companion cavalry.
His first time in battle and he's given command?
Yeah,
Holy shit. Even for a noble, that sounds
yeah.
excessive.
Also, he was 18.
Holy shit.
Yeah. So the two armies met on August 4th, 338 BC. Philip was commanding his royal guard on the right flank. His phalanx was put in the center, and Alexander's cavalry was on the left flank. Philip engaged on the right first, drawing the Athenian militia, which were very poorly disciplined, into like a wild head-on assault. Because he was like started slowly letting his troops like one step at a time move back, and the Athenians thought, "Oh, we're pushing him back. Let's commit all of our troops at once." And as they pushed further and further forward, they opened up a gap between the Athenian forces and the Theban forces, who were really well trained and knew that this was a dumb idea. And so there's this giant gap in the middle of their line. Alexander rushed all of his cavalry directly into that gap. um, when Alexander charged, Philip ordered his guys to charge. The Athenians almost immediately broke. Um, and then the phalanx in the middle rushed into the breach behind Alexander's cavalry, and they completely. The Athenians were on the run. The Thebans were completely surrounded. Um, most of the Theban troops broke pretty quickly after that. The only ones that were left were a company of elite troops in the Theban military called the Sacred Band, and they stood their ground for hours. This battle only took, like, the first part of the battle only took like 30 minutes.
Wow. A 30-minute battle?
Yeah. And it took the Sacred Band hours before they actually broke, because they were just so well trained. There were 300 of them, and by the end, only 46 were alive and taken prisoner.
Holy crap.
Yeah, very nearly fought to the last man. And actually want to talk about them for a second, because they are ridiculous. So one of the reasons that the Sacred Band was so effective and so disciplined was partly because of the way they were organized. So the Sacred Band wasn't made up of 300 individuals.
What?
It was made up of 150 couples.
I've never heard of something like that.
Yeah, so every every single guy in the Sacred Band was in a romantic relationship with another one. And so the idea was that if everyone was in a romantic relationship with another one, they would fight that much harder in battle because they wanted to protect him.
Oh, I think I've heard of something like that before. I can't tell you where, but that sounds familiar.
And it must have worked, because they were the most elite infantry troops in Greece probably at the time, and they all got wiped out in a single afternoon because Philip was just really good at his job.
Damn. I can't imagine. Jeez, that would have to be the equivalent of the SEAL Team 6 getting taken out in a split of the eye, modernly.
Yeah, it yeah, imagine like the Iranian Republican Guard Corps just comes out with like this super like these super soldiers that they just wipe out a SEAL team in like a single assault. Like that essentially be the modern equivalent. Um, so Alexander, he performed extremely well in his first time commanding troops. He carried out one of the key roles that led to the victory at Chironea. After the battle, he was assigned to a detail of dignitaries that were sent to accept the peace treaty from Athens.
Except, quote unquote.
Yeah, it the peace treaty the conditions clearly made Macedon the supreme power in Greece. But Philip was trying to be really lenient with the Greek states because, as I hinted to earlier, he had a plan for them. He wanted to consolidate them into a coalition so that he could invade the Persian Empire.
As one does.
As one does when you are the son of Zeus.
Wait, I thought Alexander was the son of Zeus, not Philip.
Well, Philip was still claimed to be descended from Hercules. So basically the same thing.
Yeah, they probably didn't make much distinction back then.
Um, so, to that end, he organized a conference at the city of Corinth and established what's called the Hellenic League, which was a joint political and military alliance between all of the Greek states, with the exception of specifically Macedon, because they were going to be in charge of it, and Sparta, because they absolutely refused to negotiate with Philip. Yeah, there's this famous famous story that after before the conference at Corinth, he Philip sent a letter to Sparta, which basically said, "How am I? I'm going to send my troops down to your lands. Will I come as a friend or as an enemy?" And the Spartans just sent a letter back that said neither.
That was ballsy.
It worked. He never bothered Sparta. Alexander wouldn't either. He never bothered with Sparta. He just left them alone.
Interesting.
And even though Macedon wouldn't be part of the Hellenic League, Philip was named the hegemon, which was the political leader of the league, and the strategos autokrator, which is like the supreme general of the Hellenic League. So he was the president and the commander in chief, even though his kingdom wasn't actually part of it.
That's weird.
Because the point of the Hellenic League was not to join all the Greek states together in equality. It was to serve as a political body which Philip could control. So it wasn't long after that something happened between Philip and Alexander, and it threw the entire Macedonian political landscape into chaos. Philip announced that he would be taking a new wife who was Macedonian. All of his wives up to that point had not been Macedonian. Alexander's own mother was from Epirus. She wasn't Macedonian. This noblewoman was named Cleopatra, no relation. Shortly after that, he publicly accused Olympias of cheating on him and being unfaithful.
Is there any? Do we know if it had any substance to it? Or
It almost definitely did not happen. She was smarter than that. She did not care about sex enough to risk her position of power just for that. She was way too clever for that. But the reason that he accused her was because Philip was starting to see Alexander as a threat to his rule.
okay,
And so because he was kind of a he was clearly afraid of Alexander and thought that Alexander and Olympias might be plotting against Philip so that Alexander could take the throne. We don't really know why, and there's not really any evidence that they were actually planning on doing that. But Philip was fully convinced, and so he married a new woman, and he had plans to have another son so he could make that son heir.
so is this pre the firstborn kind of thing?
All throughout history, there were a whole bunch of different ways of deciding, like how a king would decide who their heir was. It became codified into a lot of different legal systems in the Middle Ages that the firstborn son would accept all of the the titles that were passed down from his father. But back in the ancient period, it wasn't really as codified as that.
Okay,
Your heir was just whoever you decided it would be, whoever it was politically viable to make your heir.
so it's kind of like today now.
Yeah,
I mean, not the same, obviously, but you had freedom back then, like you do now.
yeah, kind of like if just a regular everyday person dies today, they have a will and they can decide who they leave their assets to. It was kind of the same thing with kings back then, except they had the added stuff of like they had to choose an heir who they knew would be able to stay the heir and wouldn't get overthrown, and who would also be like politically viable for the other people in court.
That so basically that his allies or enemies wouldn't object to in a way that would cause this country to go under.
Right. And it was traditionally like it was like you just gave it to your firstborn son because it was nice and easy and simple. It didn't happen with Alexander. Alexander was actually Philip's second son,
Okay.
but his older son had a mental handicap. We're not sure what exactly it was, but all of the sources say that um, I think his name was Philip Arrhelaus or something like that. He was named after his father, but he had some sort of mental handicap that everybody was kind of agreed was like, oh, he wouldn't be a very good king. And so when Alexander came around, it was kind of understood that this would be the one that we'd train up to be a king.
Wait, wasn't Olympias the third wife? Didn't you say?
Yeah, the first two wives both died in childbirth. The first,
So did so one of the childs didn't make it through?
both the childs did. The first child was the first wife had a daughter. Second wife had a son.
Okay, that makes much more sense. I was confused for a second.
Yeah, first wife had a daughter. Second wife had a son. Olympias had a son and a daughter. Fourth wife had a daughter, I think, and then this fifth wife he's about to marry is going to have a daughter and a son. But yeah, this very public break between Philip and Alexander, it came to the head at Philip and Cleopatra's wedding, or the feast that happened after the wedding. They both had a loud argument over Alexander being disinherited in front of absolutely everybody, and
Who had the argument?
it actually started between Alexander and Amyntas, who is another guy in the court. Amyntas held up his glass and raised a toast to this new marriage. Hopefully, they'd sire a legitimate heir, kind of obviously implying that Alexander was a bastard child because Olympias was unfaithful. That resulted in a screaming match where Alexander threw his wine into Amyntas's face, or not Amyntas, it was Attalus. Yeah, my bad.
How did they reconcile Alexander being the son of Philip, but also the claimed son of Zeus?
Back then, they didn't understand biology very well. They believed that if a woman had sex with multiple men and then got pregnant, that child was biologically the son of all of those men.
Interesting.
So Alexander could be the son of Zeus and Philip at the same time. Yeah, it's I might go into the like ancient Greek science and medicine sometime because it's wild. But for now, so everybody's drinking at this feast, which by the way, let's take a sip. Alexander gets into the screaming match, throws his drink in Attilus's face, and Philip stands up, draws his sword, and starts like rushing towards his son with his sword. But he's so drunk that he trips on a stool and falls over. And so Alexander takes the opportunity to go and grab his mother, and they both escape into exile and go to Epirus. The exile didn't last very long though, because the following year, Philip and Cleopatra had a child, and it ended up being a daughter, and that put Philip in a very bad spot because he was trying to start his invasion of Asia soon, while he had the Greek states under his thumb, but he couldn't leave if he didn't have a clear male heir. Because if he didn't have a clear male heir, somebody in court would take the opportunity while he was absent to overthrow him and take his throne.
So he basically was forced. His hand was forced to re-accept Alexander.
Yeah, he had to make up with Alexander, but he tried to keep Alexander's ambition in check. He didn't invite Olympias back. She stayed in Epirus, and she was not happy about it. um,
How did he convince Alexander to come back without his mother? Because
um, it Philip had a friend of Alexander's go to him and convince him to come back without his mother. We're not really history is not really sure how he did it or what he said to convince Alexander to come back, but we know it was a friend of his that Philip kind of used to bring him back. But yeah, so Olympias was not happy about it, and she convinced her brother, who is the king of Epirus, who is the guy that Alexander was named after, into declaring war on Macedon.
Oh shit.
Yeah. It actually ends without any fighting, though, because Philip realizes what happened, and he was like, "Oh God, Olympias, what are you doing?" And he just shoots off a letter to Alexander of Epirus, saying, "Hey, if you stop the war now, I'll let you marry my daughter."
That's so weird.
Okay, it gets weirder. The daughter he's talking about wasn't by one from one of his other wives. It was by Olympias,
That's his niece.
his biological niece, and he said yes.
I guess the only consolation you can say is they didn't have the taboos and they didn't know um, of the genetic defects back then.
Oh, they definitely did. They absolutely knew.
Oh, they did?
They 100% knew. Yeah. Incest was taboo back then too.
I thought that was a modern knowledge of it.
Yeah. Later on, one of the successors to Alexander's empire was Ptolemy in Egypt. His family, all of his descendants, um, would become famous for marrying their siblings.
That's gross.
It's really gross. One of his grandsons was given the name or the honorific title Philadelphia, which was Greek for sibling love.
That's disgusting.
Yeah.
He had to get that name. He had to have screwed more than one sibling. I feel like.
Well, he was. I think part of it was that I think he was the first in that family to marry a sibling. I might be mistaken, but I think it was kind of novel when he did it, which is why he got the nickname. So yeah, think about that the next time you hear the name Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love.
That takes on a whole new context.
It takes on a whole new context. And I have not been able to see the name Philadelphia the same ever since I learned that. And now all of you will suffer with me. So yeah, with that out of the way, he finally gets really serious about setting up his plans for invading Asia. He sent an advance force of 10,000 troops under the general Parmenio to start driving pro Persian troops and leaders out of the different Greek city states that were on the coast of Asia Minor. And that came at a good time, too, because the previous king of Persia had just been assassinated, and a new king named Darius III had just been installed in his place. And so Persia was kind of off its balance politically. And so weren't really able to respond to Parmenio's invasion of Asia Minor. And so now things were kind of looking up for Philip. He was about to make his meeting with Destiny in Asia. His treasonous wife had been foiled. His overly ambitious son was finally in check. And in June of 336, he was going to his daughter's wedding in the city of, I still can't pronounce it, Aiai, I think. And then during the procession, on the second day of festivities, one of Philip's bodyguards named Pausanias pulled out a sword and stabbed him right in the ribs. Killed him instantly. Now, this is going to be confusing, so try to follow with me and please ask questions if you need it.
I always ask questions when I need it.
Also, for all you listening, there's going to be a mention of some sexual assault here, so fast forward by a couple minutes if that makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah, trigger warning.
Okay. Oh yeah, somebody died Let's go ahead and take a sip. All right. Philip's assassination was really weird and ridiculous. So Pausanias, the guy who killed him, he had been Philip's lover.
I heard something about that he had a lover.
They'd
Well, I meant like like more of the famous male lover because
Oh, he had a bunch of lovers. This was just one of them.
while modern society frowns upon it, it was actually more common back in Greek society.
Yeah, it was, but it was still it was kind of a homophobic sort of gay because they only liked young men who looked feminine. That was kind of how it worked. So homophobic homosexuality, if you will. Anyways, so Pausanias had been Philip's lover a couple of years before, but Philip had dumped him for another young man who was confusingly also a member of Philip's bodyguard and was also named Pausanias. So we're with two Pausaniases here. Both are effeminate young men who have slept with the king of Macedon.
Was it like kind of a common name, Philsonius, or was it just an epic coincidence?
Um, as far as I can tell, the Macedonians only had like 10 or 11 names that they used.
Okay, so it was just a common name.
Yeah, it's just a common. Yeah. Imagine if every single name was as common as the name John.
Well, it could be. Think of it like you only got the generic names. You only got the Johns, the Mikes, the Joes, the all that is the best way I can think of it.
Yeah. So uh, Pausanias had been Philip's lover, but Philip dumped him for the other Pausanias. The first Pausanias got jealous and caused a scene where he yelled at the other Pausanias and called him a bunch of names. I think he called him a hermaphrodite was the big one.
Wow, I imagine it had a much worse context back then.
Probably, yeah. Um, the ancient Greeks were a weird sort of sexist. But the second Pausanias went and complained about it to his friend Attalus, who was Philip's uncle in law by his new wife Cleopatra. Um, so Attalus responded by inviting the first Pausanias, the one that killed Philip, or who would kill Philip, to a dinner party where he got the young man blackout drunk and then invited all of his guests to take turns raping him.
Oh fuck!
Yeah, I'm not going to ask you to drink to that alcohol reference because that's just not worth it.
No, that's the kind of time where you say nope. That's the time we say fuck you. No drink.
I mean, I'm gonna sip, but it's unrelated. Pausanias woke up the next morning and when he realized what had happened, he went straight to Philip so that he could try and hold Attalus accountable. Philip wouldn't do it because Attalus was one of his allies in court, and he needed allies in order to like protect his position from usurpers. If he started like holding his own allies accountable for crimes and stuff, then he'd lose allies and then put his position in danger.
So you're telling me that Philip protected the guy that killed him, and the guy just betrayed him and killed him?
Philip protected the guy that sexually assaulted his ex-lover
Oh,
so that he could keep his throne, and his ex-lover then went on to kill him.
okay. Yeah, I mis worded that. Yeah,
Yeah. So it very convoluted, but
it sounds like the plot of a bad romance book.
yeah, but I do mention it for a reason. And that is because there is probably more to it than just that. Because we have to keep two things in mind. First, Olympias was in town for the wedding because Philip knew that it would be very bad PR for him if he didn't allow his daughter's mother to come to the wedding.
Yeah, that kind of puts a damper on things.
And so Olympias was now back in contact with Alexander. Also, Alexander at this time was extremely concerned that he was going to miss out on his own destiny of conquering Asia. I really can't I cannot underestimate how important Alexander's sense of destiny was. And like he was willing to kill for it, and he would go on to kill multiple people
As
for it,
one
even
does.
close friends of his. in pursuit of the ultimate goal that he thought was his divine destiny of conquering Asia. And so that fear of missing out on conquering Asia, FOMO, FOMO conquering Asia, combined with his mother's influence, combined with Aristotle's lessons,
Dang.
combined with his belief in his divine heritage, um, believed that conquering Asia was his birthright. He fully 100% believed that his father was about to steal all of that away from him, that he would go down in history in complete obscurity behind under the shadow of his father. And so while we don't have any hard evidence that the two of them are involved, it's almost impossible that they didn't have some part in at least convincing Pausanias to go through with killing the king and then using him as this and then scapegoating him.
Well, how certain are we that the rape happened? Could that have been a cover story?
I mean, it. We're not. I mean, of course, we're not sure of anything. We only have the accounts of the histories to go on. But
Does it seem concrete in the history, or is it more of those one of those wishy-washy things?
yeah, yeah, it's a pretty consistent story throughout all of the different tellings of it. Is that he was killed by a besmirched lover and probably did it with Alexander and Olympias. So it's a pretty consistent story. It appears in a lot of different sources. So there's we can probably believe it. Yeah, so yeah, the basically most of the sources say pretty much all of the sources are kind of in agreement that Pausanias was like a stinted lover and killed Philip out of spite. So we can pretty much believe it. So with Philip's murder, Alexander's sister's wedding ended up doubling as a crowning ceremony for Alexander. So Alexander's first move as king was to order the execution of two brothers, two guys named Hieromenes and Arrhabaeus of Lynkestis, and Lynkestis was a minor kingdom which kind of lived under the fealty of the Argead dynasty in Pella. It was a Macedonian kingdom. It was kind of it was weird. It was kind of semi-independent, and a few generations before Alexander, the House of Lynkestis had actually overthrown the Argead king and briefly held the kingship before they were overthrown and the Argeads were restored. And so they had a historic claim to the throne of Macedon, and so Alexander saw them as a threat to the throne. He targeted them specifically because they had been openly critical of Philip, and so he could claim that they had something to do with his murder. And so, in one fell swoop, he got two of his competitors out of the way, and he passed off suspicion for the assassination off of himself.
So, what happened to the lover? Did he get executed, or what happened?
Pausanias? Oh yeah, yeah. He immediately got stabbed to death. Like he barely got a chance. He tried running and he tripped on some vines and he immediately got stabbed with a bunch of spears. His body got nailed to a wall. Also, drink. Pour one out for a Kingslayer. We always love Kingslayers. Anyway,
That's our sixth rule: drink anytime a king gets killed.
ooh, I've got some good. I got some good topics in the future if we make that a rule. Anyways, after that, he first gain tried to gain the support of like the general Macedonian people by canceling all of their taxes.
What? How did that? How did he support the kingdom?
So basically, if you were a Macedonian citizen, you no longer paid taxes.
Interesting.
Yeah. The main thing is he owned a giant gold mine. Philip had captured a gold mine during his campaigns in Thrace, and that basically paid for all of the state's expenses for a little bit.
Okay.
Not very well, because Philip was actually almost bankrupt when he died, and Alexander would be almost bankrupt for a while into his campaigns, but it kept them afloat mostly. After that, he moved to secure the recognition of his titles of hegemon and strategos autokrator of the Greek states. That proved to be pretty difficult because several rebellions rose up across the Greek peninsula, notably in Thebes. Thebes would cause Alexander a lot of trouble over the next few years. And Athens began to plot with the anti-Alexander faction in the Macedonian court. So all of the nobles that were wanting to overthrow Alexander. first he took his army to start trying to secure the loyalty of the Greek states. He took his army into Thessaly and secured their loyalty. There's a funny story where it's the first example of like the military creativity that would kind of define his strategic thinking throughout his entire career. As he approached the region of Thessaly, he was stopped in a narrow mountain pass by the Thessalian army, and they told him that they would think about it and consider whether or not they let him in. And Alexander knew that he wouldn't be able to unseat these guys because they had a narrow passageway and they were defending, so he'd lose half of his army before he managed to unlodge them.
They had a choke point.
Right. And he demonstrated both charm and that military creativity I mentioned. He told them, "Oh, that's okay. Take your time. Don't worry about it." And then while they thought about it, he had his military engineers carve a set of stairs out of one of the mountains.
Holy shit!
Carved stairs out of the mountains and sent half of his army around the mountain with these stairs into the Thessalian rear.
How did they not notice?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. But they did it. They got half the army around the other side of the mountain, completely boxed the Thessalian army in, and they were like, "Okay, yeah, you can come in." The Thessalian League immediately surrendered, and they named him Archon for life, which is basically like leader. Archon is kind of like the word leader. And so, like I mentioned earlier, Thessaly would provide some of the best cavalry in the known world to Alexander's army for the duration of his campaigns. Soon after that, he got the support of the Amphictyonic League. That's how it's pronounced. Okay. I'm having trouble spelling some of these. The Amphictyonic League, which was the political body that was associated with the Oracle of Delphi. So I mentioned the Sacred War earlier. After winning the Sacred War, the Amphictyonic League was the body that allied with Philip, and so they got the Amphictyonic League, and so by extension, the Oracle of Delphi's confirmation of Alexander's position of hegemon and strategos. Shortly after that, he was one of the cities that had rebelled, a city called Ambracia, surrendered to him and apologized for rebelling, and he didn't give them any punishment. So the support of the Oracle and the mercy he showed to Ambracia both convinced most of the Greek city-states to end their rebellions because they realized that they couldn't beat Alexander, and if they surrendered, they wouldn't get hurt. So that...
I mean, can you really blame them?
No. Philip and Alexander were both really good at what they did. So that brought Greece back into line with the exception of one city, and that was Thebes. Thebes was the most powerful city in central Greece, and that meant that it was Alexander's top priority. So the Thebans woke up one morning and they see their walls are being stared down by Alexander's army in full battle gear, lined up and ready to fight. And it just scares the shit out of them. And
As you would be.
he sent them an ultimatum that basically said, "Recognize me as hegemon of the Hellenic League, and your rebellion will be forgiven. Don't, and I'll burn your city to the ground." So yeah, they gave up without a fight. And so with Thebes out of rebellion, Athens realized their position was untenable and they surrendered. So that was all of Greece out of the way. He got Greece resecured. The next thing he had to do, and the most important thing he had to do, was to bring the faction in his own court trying to overthrow him back into line. Specifically, that was made up of the old guard of Philip's army, Parmenio, Attalus, and Amyntas. Attalus was the guy we mentioned earlier in the story about Pausanias. At that time, they were leading the advance force that was currently in Asia Minor, fighting to quote-unquote liberate the Greek cities there. It was actually fairly easy for Alexander to get them back into line, because after resubjugating Greece, the commander of those forces, Parmenio, realized that, well, I should probably throw my hat in with the winning side, and went ahead and joined Alexander.
Okay.
Amyntas followed right behind him, but Attalus held out. And Attalus being was I think Attalus was a cousin of Philip, and so had a claim to the throne. And so Alexander decided that he was too dangerous, or not a cousin. He was the uncle-in-law, but he still had a claim to the throne. And he decided that Attalus would be too great a threat to be kept alive, and so Attalus was quietly murdered. Also, I wanted to tell a couple stories real quick. So the first story is that after he brought Thebes and Athens, after he brought Greek Thebes and Athens back into line, he decided to do the same thing that Philip had done with the story I told you earlier. He decided to try the same thing. He sent a letter to Sparta, which basically said, if I decide to go into your lands, I will burn and loot and destroy your entire civilization before you even have the chance to respond. I have the entirety of the Hellenic world at my back. Maybe you should consider joining me. And so the Spartans just responded with a letter that just had one word. It said, if.
The Spartans were like, "You ain't got the balls."
And so Alexander was like, okay, that's fair. The second thing is that when Alexander pacified Thebes and accepted their surrender, he went into the city and visited them in order to accept their surrender. And while he was there, he ran into a guy who's now a very famous philosopher. Have you ever heard the name Diogenes?
Yes.
Yeah, the philosopher who condemned like all worldly pleasures or all worldly like luxuries and just lived in a bottle and jerked off in the street, lived in a barrel and jerked off in the street, I mean. Yeah. So there's a story that while he was in Thebes, he comes across Diogenes, and he has heard Diogenes'
Yep.
teachings, and he is gobsmacked to see him. He's kind of starstruck, and so he's super eager and super excited to meet this guy. He walks up while Diogenes is just sunbathing. He stands over him and he like introduces himself very regally and formally. He gives his full title, and he finishes this long spiel about who he is and what he'd like to talk to Diogenes about. Diogenes just lays there, just completely ignoring him. And so Alexander, for the first time in his life, is just standing there awkwardly, not really sure what to say. And so he finally says, is there anything that I can get you? I'm a very rich and powerful man. And Diogenes basically responds, oh, are you now? You could get out of my sun.
Oh, Diogenes gave no fucks.
and so and so Alexander just turns around and walks away. And all of Alexander's like assistants are talking about like oh, he's just a crabby old man. He's doesn't know greatness when he sees it. And Alexander interrupts them and says, if I were not Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes. Oh, I love stories about Diogenes. Anyways, so Greek states are resubjugated, his court's in order. The only thing he had left to do before he could finally start the invasion to Asia was to repacify the Illyrian and Thracian tribes on the Macedonian frontier, and to make sure that there was no threat of them invading while he was gone. So he decided that Macedon's new northern border was not going to be at the Olympic Mountains. It was going to be 100 miles north at the Danube River.
Dang.
He was going to push all the way up to the Danube. So first thing he did was he ordered a squadron of warships to travel into the Black Sea from the city of Byzantium, travel up the Danube River to a rendezvous point where he would meet with Alexander's army after he finished his conquest. That's how confident he was. I'm not just going to conquer this area. I'm going to do it in a set amount of time and meet you at the exact spot that I need you.
Dang, he was confident.
So he took his army, he set up straight north. First place he finds trouble is at a place called Shikba Pass through the Haemus mountain range. A Thracian tribe had fortified the pass by setting up a wall of wagons at the top of the slope. So there's a long slope that kind of tapered in, leading up into the entrance of the pass between these two mountains. And the Thracian tribe had set up in the pass, set up a wall of wagons around around the opening and had fortified themselves behind there. Now, any other general would have assumed, oh, they are going to use these wagons to defend themselves. They're going to use that as a wall. Alexander had a supernatural ability to tell what his enemy's strategy was before they even put it into practice. He knew that this Thracian tribe's practice or their strategy was always a forward frontal assault with broadswords because that's what they were good at. And so he realized that they wouldn't be able to do that if they were hiding behind a bunch of wagons. So he realized they were doing something else with the wagons. So he guessed that they were going to try to push the wagons down the hills to break up the lines of his phalanx and throw his line into chaos. And then while they were disorganized, they would come sweeping down the hill with their broadswords and take them out. He turned out to be 100% right. So these troops, so he guided he like had a meeting with his troops. He kind of directed them on what he wanted them to do. If they had room lower down the slope, they were supposed, whenever the wagons came coming towards them, they were just supposed to open up ranks and let it pass safely between them. And then once it passed them, they could close back ranks and keep marching. If there wasn't enough room for them to open up because it was a too narrow a part of the pass, then what they were going to do was that the first few ranks of the phalanx were going to lay down on their backs and they were going to make a ramp out of their shields.
What?
Yes, they made a ramp out of their shields. Now keep in mind, these weren't just wagons, these were like industrial wagons. These were wagons for long trips carrying hundreds of pounds of supplies. These were not light wagons. These were wagons that weighed at least 800 pounds apiece.
Jesus Christ. They'd be crushed.
Logically speaking, anybody who tried to do that should have been crushed, or at the very least, if it actually made it up the ramp of shields, it would immediately come down on their comrades right behind them.
Yeah.
But according to all of the sources, it worked.
That has to be made up.
It has to be made up, but every single source tells the exact same story the same way. That they made ramps out of their shields. These wagons came rolling down the slope, flipped off of these ramps, and landed safely behind the phalanx.
That sounds like something straight out of a cartoon.
It is from a cartoon, and it can't be real, but every single source says it is.
I think that's one of those times where history just got lucky and the lie was told so well that everyone reported it the same.
Maybe. I don't know. I choose to believe it happened. So, yeah, so it actually worked. The wagons got past. The wagons just passed safely past them, and the tribe that they were fighting, when they realized that their plan didn't work, they just immediately broke and ran. They ran right through the pass. They got chased down by Alexander's cavalry and by his archers, and by the end of it, 1,500 tribesmen were dead.
Jesus.
As far as I know from the sources that we have, none of the Macedonians were killed.
Holy crap. That's really successful.
Yeah, you're going to be surprised at some of the death counts. I chose the conservative estimates for a lot of the death counts of these battles. And they're still just ridiculously lopsided. But we'll get to that in later episodes because we're going to go ahead and shut this down. Tim, do you have any pluggables?
Pluggables.
Yeah, any social media you want people to know about?
They can find me on Twitter at Tim, aka Otis.
Well, I want lots of people to follow my Twitter account because I have lots of very good takes. So you can follow me at Visigoth. The first I is a 1 and the O is a 0. So yeah, go follow me. I have correct opinions.
If you're looking to follow our social media dedicated solely to the podcast, follow us on Facebook and Instagram at the Alexandria Society Pod and on Twitter at Alex Society Pod.
All right, I officially call this meeting to end.
See y'all next time.